sharing this is meant to last a week? The question bounced around my mind as I sat staring at the immense plate, meat glistening with savory juices, towering mounds of potatoes, bread so clean and white it seemed otherworldly, an untouched apple resting like a prize at the top, and coffee dark and fragrant, sending steam curling into unfamiliar warmth. Stunned, I whispered my worry aloud, the words slipping in a language that felt more like defense than curiosity, and one of the American guards laughed, a simple sound that echoed the comfort in the room, telling me not to let it cool, to dig in before I could overthink abundance, before caution or suspicion had the chance to spoil the taste. I'd never seen a meal so extravagant in a single helping. In the camp back home in Germany, rations were a negotiation, every bite a cautious promise, each crumb carried on borrowed hope as the days skittered past more out of habit than purpose. Memories of the barracks flickered in the back of my mind, the brittle conversation about ration cards, the bleak stretch from one meal to the next, the thin soup shining with little more than reflected longing, the dry bread that turned to dust between the teeth, weeks spent imagining feast days that never came. Now, the American camp was a different world, almost hostile in its comfort, every clatter of a tray a reminder that plenty was possible, even casual, for someone else, but for me, it felt threateningly unreal. I watched the others, former comrades, sometimes friends, take their food, shoulders tense as wild animals testing safe water, eyes never settling for long. Some of them muttered about the portion sizes, quietly marveling, trading nervous jokes with caution, while others turned inward, silent and measured, as if struggling to accept the change as anything more than a mistake. A corporal with a kindly face told me, "Everyone gets their fill, but wait for your next turn," and it became clear that fairness here wasn't an afterthought but a rule, and for a moment, that simple regulation felt radical, even revolutionary. Instinctively I covered my apple with my palm, a motion left over from months of want that taught me to guard every luxury, just in case it vanished. Across the table, I saw Schreiber quietly mumbling in gratitude not loud enough to disturb anyone, his lips moving as though blessing the heat rising from the potatoes. Fink, once a baker in his civilian years, lifted his piece of bread to the light, watching it glow translucent and imagining, so I guessed, the thriving ovens he'd lived by before war came and changed the meaning of flour. The conversation at our table drifted from the food itself to how it shaped our days, and the sense of a new language forming, expressions like, "help yourself before it gets cold," or, "seconds for those who wait," echoed across the hall, each one feeling strange, a language of abundance that couldn't be easily trusted by men raised on scarcity. The American soldiers moved about briskly, their routines efficient, their uniforms neat and faces mostly untroubled, each interaction measured and unremarkable, no drama but no hostility either. They seemed genuinely content to enforce rules that made meals fair instead of competitive, unlike the bitter coldness of competition for morsels at the start of my captivity. After lunch, we were marched quietly back toward the compound, the fence tracing out a boundary that didn't keep freedom in, but rather defined our new ordinary. It kept confusion, guilt, and the strangeness of too much contained within. Walking across the yard, I thought back over the journey that had brought me here, the passage from cramped German trains rattling past bombed fields, the jostle from barracks to barracks as prisoners of war, the haunting images of ration books filled in with hope then crossed out by disappointment, the occasional moments where bread was shared in secret, a gesture never out of generosity but pure, defensive survival. Throughout the barack that night, conversation rippled in ways I hadn't heard since before surrender, men comparing strange new foods, trying out the foreign names, apple pie, mashed sweet potatoes, gravy thick enough to cover anything. The former sergeant, a relic of a different German army with his mustache and fondness for dark jokes, told a story about American ice, cubes clinking in a glass, cool even in summer, and our table grew thoughtful, the idea of cooling anything for pleasure as exotic as a fairy tale from a distant continent. Someone mentioned home, and across every face passed the shadow of a question, well, what's left of home except a belly full of foreign food, or will memory punish us for having eased so far from where we belong? I slept that night feeling oddly full, too much so. The emptiness I'd carried for months receded, pain replaced with warmth but tinged by guilt. The next morning brought the whistle, another line for coffee not made from chicory or beet but from real beans, dark and bitter, the flavor urgent and new. At breakfast, the lieutenant read out rules we'd never known, how work assignments promised coupons for the camp canteen, how books from the library were for anyone able to read them, how there would be classes in everything from English to the American Constitution, offered as if we were students rather than captives. I watched Fink smile as he signed on to farm detail, sensing his hands were eager for flour again, even just to haul sacks or touch grain that might someday become more than sustenance. Later we boarded a truck for a local farm, the fences a little looser, the sky wide and blue overhead, more freedom than I'd expected, if still under watch. On arrival, the farmer tipped his hat, neither wary nor friendly, and his wife, standing at the back step, brought water and a loaf of bread so white and soft my fingers trembled around it. She served coffee out of chunky cups, her English slow but kind, her eyes searching our faces for traces of home. I saw fresh pies cooling on the counter beside a basket of fruit, and I blurted out my old worry, half amused, half afraid, is all this meant to last a week? Her answer, quiet but firm, was, no, that's just lunch. Slices appeared, wrapped carefully as gifts, and I took mine, treating it carefully, wondering about the transaction, whether kindness here was truly free or just another line to toe in the long ledger of war. Beneath the high sun, we labored together, prisoners and guards both, and as sweat streaked my face, the old boundaries slipped away for an hour or two. Work became the bridge and the bread at noon the currency for camaraderie, not suspicion. The farmer asked about Germany, about families and home, about whether we had expected such food, and when the answer came out as a cautious no, I felt something honest seep through, a shared, unspoken relief that daily hunger wasn't always the story. In moments between work, we bickered and bantered, comparing the taste of apples from different trees, talking about recipes no one believed we'd see again. After returning to camp, everyone was quieter. Evening routines returned, with books offered by a thoughtful clerk with wild gray hair. I picked a thin book of German poetry, reading lines about bread and longing into the darkness, realizing hunger was the secret subject of almost every stanza. Another night brought film reels, images flickering across a sheet, terrible scenes of concentration camps revealed for the first time, the silent shock moving through the assembled men like bad weather. Some men wept, others stared at the floor, shame, anger, regret. The emotional tide was too complex to name, but I understood that even comfort couldn't erase the burden of what we learned. The food, afterward, carried a different taste, salter, heavier, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow that could not be unlearned. Sleep came late, haunted by the images and stories unfolding day after day, the slow rebuilding of trust that maybe comfort and goodness could exist without strings. I wrote letters I never sent, drafts explaining the strange abundance, the hard labor, the cautious friendships with men who hours earlier were enemies. Each letter began with, I am well. I work each day. I eat enough, and ended quietly, the truth somewhere between what could be shared and what could only be carried. Over days and weeks the rhythm of the camp settled in, punctuated by small miracles, a bag of bread tucked into my jacket by the farmer's wife, an extra apple on the tray, guards who looked the other way when jokes or songs bubbled up after supper. A sense grew that we were all trying to learn, to remake ourselves from scarcity into something new but not yet trustworthy, to reconcile guilt with gratefulness, remembering the lean months before, not to punish ourselves but as proof that we were capable of changing, even if only a little. As autumn came, rumors twined about repatriation, of going home, and the compound filled with the hope and fear of what return would mean. Some said they might never accept comfort again, others planned to cultivate small kindnesses in their own villages, seeds scattered during captivity that might, if the storms ever passed, grow into mercy. I felt the wire fence around the camp less as prison, more as a marking line. It now enclosed a place of learning, of reckoning, of forgiveness not granted but worked toward with every meal eaten without envy. And so, sharing this, having enough for a week, and more, became not just a question about food, but a question about becoming, about what a man chooses to build from fortune and misfortune, about the slow, uncertain project of making peace not merely with abundance, but with the shame and memory of want. The story of the meal would echo through every letter home, every conversation across the table, as a caution and a hope, proof that in the aftermath, after every fight, after every fence, there remained opportunities to divide blessings without dividing hearts. The days settled into a rhythm that seemed impossible months earlier, and as autumn's sharp chill crept into the mornings, our routine inside the American camp became both a source of stability and a sort of gentle disorientation, the familiarity of footsteps on gravel replaced gradually by softer, quieter markers, bird song before sunrise, the faint hum of a truck engine starting for the fields, the aroma of brewing coffee growing into an expected comfort rather than a rare miracle. Each dawn, the whistle cut through fog, and lines of German prisoners shuffled past rows of neat, low barracks toward the mess hall, the warmth inside now less surprising but never fully accepted as normal. For me, taking the tray each morning still brought a pulse of tension and wonder. Would today be the day the old world rushed back in, rations cut, bread slices trimmed razor thin, meat vanished from the menu and replaced, as so often before, with memory and hope? But each day, the abundance held, as genuine as the breath escaping in pale clouds above us, and the American steady process, marked by the clang of ladles against metal, guards' voices calling roll, the clerk at the door checking names, anchored us in a new kind of order that was part discipline, part care. After breakfast, most days began with work assignments, a list pinned near the mess, names scratched in pencil, each man paired to a task. I often found myself back on the farm detail, riding in an open truck out along roads bordered by whispering corn and sunflowers now heavy with seed. The land, so much like Germany's yet with broader skies and a steadiness only distance from war could offer, worked its balm on my nerves. The labor was honest, bodies slouched but purposeful, and the rhythm of movement, hoisting sacks, tuning out the ache of muscle, began to knit us together beyond the lines of language or past allegiance. Sometimes, our American guards joined in, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened by the same rich soil, their fatigue genuine, laughter easy and unforced as we bent beneath the same loads. The farmer, whose fields we helped ready for winter, spoke sparingly, but occasionally paused near us to nod in approval or offer a rare compliment in his reluctant English. His wife made rounds with water and once, after a long morning shucking corn, appeared with honey sandwiches tucked in wax paper, the sweetness almost too much for tongues so long used to sour. It was at her table I felt the first stirrings of peace, a quiet moment, sunlight falling like grace through patchy windows, where no one needed to guard their plate, and voices rose and fell in an easy music that called forth memories of civilian life nearly lost in the churn of uniform and duty. One afternoon, after an exhausting stint stacking firewood, the farmer invited us inside for stew. Sitting around his kitchen table, surrounded by ticking clocks and the faded photographs of a family who eyed us with wary curiosity, I found myself discussing not the war but the land, the stubbornness of weeds, the patience of seasons, the way hail could ruin even the best laid plans. My halting English, strengthened by nightly lessons from borrowed books, made the exchange slow but sincere, and it dawned on me, a realization at once liberating and melancholy, that here, in this patched, sunlit room, my role as a prisoner had been quietly overshadowed by something closer to neighbor. The sound of laughter, mine, the farmer's, even his wife's bright chime, felt so rare it could have been its own kind of nourishment, one that would have been forbidden or unthinkable so few months before. Back at the compound, the evenings grew thoughtful. Some men traded stories for cigarettes, sharing old love letters and tales of birthdays missed. Others, restless, paced small circles around the barbed wire fence, eyes grazing the distant line of pines as if hope itself might shuffle over the horizon at dusk. I joined the handful who gathered in the makeshift library, paging through whatever volumes we could find, dictionaries, history books, a battered copy of Goethe that sparked impromptu recitations, English poetry read aloud with thick German accents and half-understood enthusiasm. Books became currency more reliable than chocolate, ideas exchanged as gifts, not as bargains. Here, I met Jan, who'd been a teacher in Hamburg, now a quiet, measured friend who lent me an American novel, something about a young man crossing the sea to find work. That book, absorbed over a long week by candlelight, tangled my mind with notions of second chances and the strange, unchosen brotherhood of those forced into exile. Time softened some of the stresses of captivity. Guards and prisoners, with months marked by mundane repetition, started to see beyond labels. An American named Carter, big and sunburned, explained baseball one evening as we idled near the rec field. His demonstration, awkward, hilarious, transformed a patch of trampled grass into a field of shouts and laughter, the lines between us blurring beneath the simplicity of a game's shared rules. Victories were humble, scoring a run, stealing a base, but in every playful tackle and burst of cheering, a hidden lesson played out, that abundance was not just about calories or comfort, but about being permitted to enjoy futures again, to find delight in something as ordinary as a ball game, a privilege as much emotional as it was physical. Yet, for all the progress, guilt and unease never vanished. Letters home were brief, censored by scissors and American suspicion, every word chosen meticulously, haunted by the lives left behind in bomb-scarred towns, in families rationing hope alongside flour. The irony of our situation, a full belly, a gentler schedule, books, and sport, gnawed at me. I could not ignore rumors filtering from new arrivals, stories of starvation and black markets in Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, loved ones traded for bread, a mother's hands red from scrubbing other people's floorboards in exchange for a precious egg or handful of potatoes. Sometimes, lying awake, the pang of memory and the ache of responsibility formed a knot in my chest. It was not difficult to eat here, but it was impossible to forget why it was astonishing. Plenty, once radical, became a daily tension, part blessing, part reminder of loss. The camp chaplain, a patient man with weary eyes, began holding informal talks on Sundays. He spoke not of sin or penance but of forgiveness, not just between nations but within our own hearts. He told of his own son fighting far away, uncertain and scared, and read from letters he'd received, their content cautiously hopeful, as if hope required apology. One Sunday, he gathered us outside beneath the golden leaves and quoted a poem about bread, about how breaking and sharing it was an act that connected past to present, captors to captives, even enemies to allies if enough humility could be mustered. The words landed gently, making some bristle but others, like me, reflect with aching clarity. This abundance wasn't about forgetting deprivation, but about understanding how to use plenty as an act of restoration, when the world next allowed us to be home. As October faded into November, the prospect of repatriation transformed the mood yet again. The wire fences felt less like fortress walls, more like mere waiting places for a process none of us could hurry or predict. Some men found purpose in preparing, relearning skills for trades now upended by war, volunteering for extra work details, poring over English textbooks as if language could speed up the next chapter. Others withdrew, made cynical by uncertainty, distrustful of even the smallest act of generosity. I watched as friendships formed and dissolved according to rumors of lists and quotas, some men marking days on the bunks in chalk, calculating when it might be their turn to board the train east and leave this strange garden of enough. One frosty afternoon, the farmer found me before departure and pressed into my palm a tiny packet, inside, a few seeds, beans, dried and dark. "For your mother," he said, choosing each word as if laying stones carefully for their weight and purpose. "Plant when you return. Start again." The gesture struck me silent, the thought that abundance, however fleeting, could be transferred like trust, stitched into the future even as we packed our meager belongings and rehearsed speeches for family reunions. The final week approached in a haze of cold and anticipation. I stood with Fink and Schreiber atop a small rise just outside the camp, the intricate geometry of fences catching the last sunlight. Fink mused, more to the horizon than to us, that plenty, once tasted, never really left a person. That hunger burned memory deep, a lesson in self and compassion, but that sharing, freely, could reshape regret into gratitude. Schreiber, remember his quiet prayers over potatoes, said he would forever say grace, whether there was bread or merely hope on his table. Packing for the journey home, measured now in hours instead of endless days, I was handed, almost by accident, a final sandwich by the farmer's wife. Tucked between slices of fresh-baked bread, a scrap of hand-drawn paper read, "Safe journey. Remember." At that moment, surrounded by people I'd once thought of only as captors, I realized the story I'd one day tell would not simply be about American food or German hunger, but about the invention of trust on unlikely ground, about how the arithmetic of sharing is done not with numbers, but with acts of daily, stubborn kindness that ripple outward, changing not just those who receive, but those who choose to give. The train that would take us home seemed less a machine and more a slow-moving spell, humming with the nervous energy of men who had spent entire seasons wondering whether this crossing would ever come to pass. We filed on, our breath fogging in the morning air, belongings packed tight against stories and memories that weighed more than any satchel, and through the open windows the American guards shouted words that had somehow become both orders and wishes: "Good luck. Safe travels. Don't forget us." I took my seat opposite Schreiber, who gripped his sandwich as if it might evaporate before the journey's end, his pale blue eyes fixed on the world outside, a blur of fields and small towns sinking beneath the first frost, colors running together like paint in the rain. There was a moment when the familiar security of the camp, once so foreign, flickered away behind us, and a new unease took hold, the burden of anticipation, the riddle of return. The train rumbled through villages that seemed immune to time, smoke slanting from chimneys, laundry stretched on lines, the ancient faces of women glancing up as we passed, indifferent or perhaps spent of all reaction after years watching uniformed men come and go. The countryside unwound itself slowly, the tracks carving a careful path along rivers glinting with weak sun, and we sat mostly in silence, hunger now a memory, replaced by an odd fullness, as if every cell in our bodies understood this was an ending wrapped around a beginning. With each stop came the mix of hope and anxiety. Would our names be called, or would we return to the train, delayed another night, told to wait for a transport that might never arrive? Some men clung to stories of families left behind, recounting their addresses in quiet voice as if repetition alone could pave the way home. Others, more cautious, barely spoke, exhaustion flattening them against the hard wooden seats. My mind wandered to the packet of seeds, carefully folded away, and I rehearsed what I would say when I saw my mother, less about the war's cruelty and more about the wonders and odd kindnesses among strangers. Outside, farmhouses flickered by, a lone dog barking, a scarecrow forgotten in a corner, someone on a bicycle raising a hand before realizing the insignia on the train was not friend or foe, just men in transit who looked more tired than dangerous. The border itself was anticlimax, officials checking papers, wagons searched, words exchanged in clipped voices, but by now the language of checkpoints felt faded, almost theatrical. A Red Cross representative handed out blankets and bitter chocolate, her accent comforting in its familiarity, her eyes searching each face for an unspoken story. For a brief moment, we became merely men in need, not soldiers, not prisoners, and I watched the relief flicker across faces as the blankets wool settled on their shoulders, as the chocolate softened between teeth grown unaccustomed to sweetness. The American guard saluted, some with genuine regret in their eyes, and just as the train lurched forward, Carter's voice floated down the line, "You taught us as much as we taught you, don't forget baseball." And men, some smiling, waved back, unsure if this was gratitude or a quiet plea for the world to stay large and forgiving. The German landscape, once so familiar, now felt foreign, buildings patched with new wood, roads rutted but swept of rubble, and here and there, small fires burning in the courtyards, smoke drawn up like prayers for better seasons to come. Letters from friends and relatives surfaced, word trickling through local officials trying to manage the tide of returnees, some messages stiff, censored, repeating official hopes, but others raw, handwritten, scrawled with the desperate waver of someone who has held too much inside for too long. The greeting at each station was cautious. Mothers, wives, children walked forward with faces tense, uncertain whether joy or worry would carry the day. There were tears and gasps, hurried embraces, some men collapsing with exhaustion in the arms of women who could not decide whether to rejoice or weep for the changed men pressing cold cheeks against their palms. In the confusion, Schreiber and I drifted apart, his figure swallowed by a group of villagers, while Fink lingered long enough to slip me a folded note, a recipe written out in his careful hand, a promise that if we survived this, bread would never be just bread again, but a sacrament of forgiveness and abundance. Home was, at first, nearly unrecognizable, rooms hollowed by absence, tables thinner, clocks all out of time. My arrival was greeted not with fanfare or chorus, but the stunned silence of those trying to measure joy against the weight of lost years. My mother's hands shook as she traced my face, her touch both assessment and benediction, her first words a gentle scolding for being thin, her next a brittle joke about how we'd eat well with me here now. Around the hearth, familiar faces, older, eyes rimmed with hard-earned wisdom, tiptoed into stories, testing whether I could bear to hear of hungry winters, of neighbors vanished, of the careers and laughter ground to powder beneath the machinery of war. In the morning, I brought out the seeds, setting them gently on the table, telling her about the farmer, the feast, the fields that held promise. She listened, eyes welling with a mix of pride and loss, and resolved to plant them when the earth was ready, a silent contract with a future that still felt perilously uncertain. Village life drummed on, as if it had been simply waiting for the men to return before resuming its patient routines, wood chopped, bread baked, paths swept as autumn's gold yielded to early frost. In small ways, I tried to carry forward the habits the Americans had seeded in me, sharing food more freely, offering stories as gifts, fixing what could be repaired, refusing, as much as possible, to let want sour the grace of enough. Some villagers bristled, wary, resentful of perceived softness, unwilling to forgive the generosity of former enemies, but slowly, as days grew longer and bellies more reliably filled, the network of care thickened. I taught the neighbor's son a strange new game with sticks and a stitched ball, laughter echoing against barns hastily rebuilt. Evenings were spent in the flickering glow of lanterns, reading aloud, Goethe, yes, but also passages from American novels borrowed from the small, battered camp library I'd slipped into my satchel. Kindness, I learned, was not a currency to be kept banked away, but something to trade endlessly, because each exchange left both the giver and the receiver a little richer. I wrote to Schreiber, Fink, Carter, even the farmer and his wife, careful to avoid bitterness. Their replies, sometimes slow in coming, thrummed with the same mixture of relief and longing, stories of harvests, new apprenticeships, the arrival of children and, on occasion, the quiet grief for friends who would never write again. Every meal, every loaf of bread sliced and shared with neighbors, felt like a way to answer the question that had haunted me from the first day in the American mess: is this enough to last a week, or a lifetime? I learned to live with uncertainty, to sit down at the table with hope and regret and let each have what was due, knowing that no boundary mattered so long as there was enough to eat, enough to share, enough to start again. As winter deepened and then, finally, retreated, I watched the first green shoots crest the garden, bean vines trembling in the clean air, and I realized the answer was neither simple arithmetic nor empty gratitude. The miracle was not just plenty, but the slow, persistent work of remembering that, once, even the shock of abundance could become, with care and patience, its own kind of home. Spring's first warm wind drifted through the village, and with it a tremor of possibility, earth soft beneath our fingers, gardens seeded and spirits slowly thawing alongside the land. My mother and I bent together over the small row beside the kitchen, fingers searching out the best soil for the farmer's beans, our hands dirty but hearts lighter, planting not just for hunger but hope. Neighbors came and went, a few curious at first, then, seeing green shoots push through and the yield mounting, offering their own handfuls of saved seeds, scraps, and advice. We built rows wider, pulled weeds as the sun crept high, and when we stood at the gate in the evenings, sweating from honest work, the simple act of sharing a cucumber or a bowl of new potatoes felt like casting a stone into a well and hearing possibility echo all the way through. In each meal at home, every loaf or slice passed across the table, I told stories about that American camp, about the farmer's gentle nods and Carter's baseball lessons, about how laughter had carved a path back to trust, about sandwiches wrapped with messages that unraveled the barbs of suspicion so slowly one could barely remember the weight. At first, some at the table listened in silence or turned away, old loyalties stiff, the pride of survival wary of compassion from the other side. But the hunger, I learned, had taught us all. Our village, once fearful of new ways and ideas brought back in battered knapsacks, found room again for forgiveness. It crept in, as quietly as the sweet scent of bread, and softened the rough edges of every conversation. Surrounded by the green hush of the garden, I began to help the local schoolteacher organize books, some tattered, one or two borrowed from the stacks I'd rescued in the American camp. Instead of lessons about discipline and scarcity, I read with the children stories about kindness, fairness, the marvel of second chances, and watched their faces light up at descriptions of foods and games they'd never tasted or played. At night, under a battered lamp with the wind rattling the shutters, I wrote more letters to Fink, to Carter, to Schreiber, telling them not only of our vegetable harvest and the stubborn pride of neighbors sharing jam in chipped cups, but of how the village had changed. Word of distant friends filtered back slowly, Carter marrying a nurse he'd met after the war, Fink baking daily in a large town and leaving slices of bread on the windowsill for children orphaned by the fighting, Schreiber fathering twins and insisting each swore to always leave the last slice for the next person at the table. The beans my mother and I had planted in spring grew so quickly that neighbors soon began to joke, the camp farmer must have sent magic. In truth, it was patience, sunlight, and the daily offering of care, small, persistent choices, that turned one handful of seeds into enough to share. Sitting together at the harvest, the scent of grass thickening, I realized that the arithmetic of war had always been simple but hard: divide things and survive, but multiply trust and you build a future. When autumn returned and I gathered the dried beans for next year's planting, I pressed a few into an envelope and sent them with a letter to Carter, hoping, wherever he was, he'd see that one season of plenty, honestly shared, could ripple outward, unending, a legacy not of victory or defeat, but of courage to offer more than what was needed, every time, for as long as soil and memory lasted.